We're here for another episode of Clean Tech Talk. Joining us today is Susan Muller, Senior Energy Analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I'm Zach Shahan, CEO of CleanTechnica. Today we're going to be focusing on offshore wind power, a really fun, exciting topic. Reminds me a little bit of where solar was a decade ago or 15 years ago. So it's a fun one. It's not a mature industry yet, but it's a competitive and quickly growing industry. But to start off, though, Susan, can you give us a little background on how you got into your role, what you did, what you've done in leading into this, and what you do at UCS?
Sure. And first of all, thank you for having me. Clean Tech Talk is fantastic. I actually started my professional life as an environmental lawyer. You can see the environmental law statutes back here.
Yeah.
And I worked for 11 years at the Environmental Protection Agency. And towards the end of that time, I was working on the clean air enforcement. So I was actually lucky. They don't usually let lawyers do this, but I got to go along on an inspection of a coal-fired power plant. And what really set my trajectory was when I realized that the technology wasn't, as complex as you would think, right? That we were in this 10-story building that was actually just a boiler boiling water to make steam to spin a turbine. And sort of that's when I'm not an engineer, but started to think about, there are other ways to spin a turbine, other ways to make electricity. And again, my background was enforcing the Clean Air Act. So this power plant, this was before EPA was regulating carbon dioxide, but this power plant was emitting mercury, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, particulate matter, causing really terrible health effects. So I started just looking at that whole set of health effects and was teaching about it. And this was in the early 2000s. And then I started saying, what about carbon dioxide? What about those emissions? And so sort of fast forwarding, that led me to focus on, well, how else can we make electricity without all those regular health problems, and also without all those carbon emissions. And this was right about the time, sort of 2010, 2011, when offshore wind was taking off in Europe, in the UK. And really since that time, I've been focused on the offshore wind potential in the United States, especially in New England. And so my work at UCS, I'm part of our Power Ahead campaign. And we research and we help explain the best ways to decarbonize the power grid. And sometimes it can get very wonky. So that's why we try to have a lot of explainers. And my particular work is focused on the New England power grid and what happens when you add offshore wind to it, like large quantities, because New England's really one of the leading regions in that area.
Yeah. I said we would get to policy in the second half of the podcast, but it just your mention. I mean, I remember in early 2010s when it started taking off in UK, off the coast of Germany, and that region, and it was a really exciting period because that's when it really started to scale up and really started to become a commercial entity, commercial choice, and it's been really quite depressing how slow the U.S. has been to get on board. It's one of the difficult things about offshore power to me is we have so much potential. We have so much potential in the United States, and it's such a great source, which we'll jump into that now, but that it's really, we should have had it should be much more mature in the U.S. than it is. But I do appreciate you guys doing, as you all doing everything you can to make it that, because without your fight, without your push, without changing the narrative, which it shouldn't have to be changed, but we know it has to be changed often, we wouldn't be even anywhere near where we are today. So let's jump into. Let's start with, I think, what you reached out about, which is some of the key benefits of offshore wind power and why it's a great cost competitive and great choice as far as cost competitiveness and electricity costs and reliability.
Sure. I would say that's really sort of what we are trying to communicate, is that there are benefits besides the obvious ones, right? Like everyone knows that offshore wind is clean, right? You can sort of intuitively get that we're not burning anything. So everybody knows it's clean, and they can imagine the health benefits from that and the climate benefits. But what has not been appreciated, in which there's a false narrative that about reliability and affordability. And in fact, there's a lot of data now, especially in New England, that shows, in fact, offshore wind is almost uniquely reliable because the power off our coast tends to increase. If you think about winter, if you've ever been out on the water or gone to the beach in New England in the winter, it tends to be incredibly windy, right? This is sort of, and I was realizing in general, we all sort of know this, right? If you think about wind chill and, anywhere in the north, but like if you're listening to a weather report in the winter, you'll hear, oh, the temperature is going to be cold, and there's often a wind chill advisory. It's just this sort of just basic fact about weather that when it's cold, we tend to have stronger winds. And so that ends up being really important for the power grid, right? We just have this automatic increase in power in the winter, which is when we use more power. So that reliability benefit has been, I'd say, underappreciated. And it's certainly the narrative, people like to say, oh, it's intermittent. In fact, it's not, it's variable. But generally speaking, and, this is when I say that New England has years of data looking at these wind speeds, they really consider it to be very reliable. And to the point that it's not just advocates saying this, the head of the New England Power Grid, Gordon Van Wheely, has said this in testimony. He's saying it later this week to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that offshore wind improves the reliability of the power grid in New England.
Look, it's this easy to charge at home with a Vico charging station. It just takes 5 seconds, and it's easier than fueling up a gas car. Plus, you can monitor it on the app and schedule charging for times with low rates.
Yeah, no, I mean, as a Floridian, it is definitely very foreign to me, the idea that you use more power in the winter than in the summer.
Yeah.
But it's definitely, it's an interesting point, and it does come across as an interesting point that it's windier in the winter. But in general, I think we know it's windy by the water often, but we also know there's still times, still days. But when you go further out onto the water, anyone who's done that, that there's wind, there's more wind out there, and it's almost a constant. So it's just you're gonna have really steady and decently strong winds offshore. And one of the great things about offshore wind power that we've talked about for a decade plus is, with solar and onshore wind, you do have variability that you have to manage a bit, that you have to plan around, have batteries for, whatever. Offshore wind power is almost provides the consistency of like a thermal power plant or a hydropower. It's always out there blowing, so it's always been a great complementary source for clean power to onshore and solar, and there are clearly some financial benefits to that consistency as well. But I'll let you get into that, and I don't know if you want to just jump into that or explain the merit order effect, which is a really fun topic, which we used to cover a lot. It gets really fun when you look at how far that can go with a more and more clean powered grid. But what do you want to say more about reliability or just jumping into merit order effect and whatnot?
So I'd say very quick to wrap up sort of the high level of reliability. I mean, it is true that offshore wind, generally, you're right, it is much more steady. And in fact, it's we just happen to be very lucky. In the Northeast, we have some of the strongest and steadiest winds in the world, right? So if you were sort of rating, how steady and strong is it, when you look across the world, in the Northeast, we have world-class resources. I think it's an average of 10 meters per second or something. Just like a caveat there, or a clarification, it does vary. So even during like a cold snap, I almost picture it's like something that's like catching its breath, right? That sort of like will have a huge 3 days of enormous strong winds, and then there's sometimes, maybe a 12, 24-hour pause, and then it goes back up. But what seems to sort of help people think about it is, if you picture sort of a curve with the energy, it's generally very high. There's some dips and then it's high again. You picture, think back to calculus or whatever, all the area under the curve, like that's all energy, and that's all going onto the power grid. And so you still do need to fill in those gaps, but it's much less. And so the rest of the power grid has to work less, you burn less fuel. And then one other small point, but this has become very important in New England. We've noticed we have a very large rooftop solar fleet. It's at times it can be 6 gigawatts, which is like can be a third or even half of the power we use. No one was thinking that solar could help in the winter, but the way the weather works in New England in particular, when we have those few calm, very cold days, it tends to be very sunny. And so the great thing is that the offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar work together. And the grid operator, when they study this, they show that when they all work together, you actually do have that consistency.
Hey, EV drivers, how much could you be saving on charging? Enter your zip code at ev.energy/join to find the best deals and utility programs near you. Sign up, connect your EV, and let EV Energy handle the rest, helping you save money and even earn cash incentives where available. Smarter charging, lower costs, and a smaller carbon footprint. What are you waiting for? Start earning today with EV Energy.
Yeah, the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, Fraunhofer ICE in particular. I think it's Institute of Solar Energy, I believe is what ICE stands for. They've done great reports in the past, studies showing just how complementary wind and solar typically are. Again, there's always unique cases, unique days, but more or less you often have wind blowing when the sun is not shining, and sun shining when the wind is not blowing, and they support each other very well. They're very complementary. So it's not surprising to hear that you found that in New England as well. But it is a great benefit of the two of them that I think a lot of people probably don't know. So it's worth probably sharing that every time we talk about this. But yeah, it's great to hear. And yeah, New England, I mean, the UK has been a leader, and Germany has been a leader in offshore wind with great wind resources off their coast. But again, like New England has such great resources, and they're sitting there to be, we're waiting for it to be a global leader in this field because it just has the potential to be. But where do you want to go next? You want to talk about New England's resources more, or do you want to jump into the merit order effect and costs?
Let's see. So the merit order effect is really fun, but it is very wonky. Maybe just a little bit more. We'll finish up with New England's resources because this is actually sort of an area that this is sort of the good news that I sort of generally see, which I try to share with people. New England has these incredible offshore wind resources, as you mentioned. We also have very strong onshore wind. It's mostly right now in northern Maine. We're building more transmission to access more of it. But in addition, as I mentioned, we have this solar resource. And this is, I think you mentioned Germany. There are places that you don't think of as being particularly sunny. And New England's like that too. We're not like Florida. But I just heard recently, Rhode Island, they call it the ocean state, but it's sort of like our sunshine state. I think they get 16% of their power from solar energy.
Wow. Yeah, no, there's some states up there that are really pulling more than their weight, that's for sure. And the Sunshine State hasn't historically been the best. We've gotten better, but we still have not the best policies in all regards, and some challenges. But yeah, there are some northeastern states that yeah, when you really pull out their stats and look at things on a per capita or per terawatt hour basis, are doing exceptionally well with solar. But I didn't know Rhode Island was like the sunshine state of the Northeast. But that
Well,
is
I just
interesting.
made that up right there, but I
Oh,
was
well, I love it. I mean, they should run with it. It's great tourist.
yeah. Yeah, but I guess it's sort of to your point. It's the resources there, and in places you might not expect, right? Like Vermont, I think might be one of our leaders. You don't think of Vermont as being particularly sunny, but it's really because Rhode Island has, through policy, they are harnessing what they have, and so this is sort of one of the things that is unappreciated about New England is that we have an enormous amount of solar power. We are actually, unlike offshore wind, we are actually sort of putting panels on roofs and we're starting to harness it. And that's giving us these incredible, we just had a recent record setting day where I mentioned, I think we had 6.6 gigawatts of solar and the grid itself was using, I think only twice that. So solar was maybe
Wow.
more than half. Yeah.
Wow.
And we're having increasing numbers of days. And the best part from a health and climate perspective was that pushed gas off. This will be a good segue to the merit order effect. But solar energy was used first, and gas, because it has higher operating costs, those plants were shut off. And at one point, we were using only 1.5 gigawatts of gas, 12% of the mix. So this is part of we've only harnessed some of the solar that we have.
Yeah, and across the U.S., including the Northeast, gas, which historically is called natural gas, but a lot of our readers have pushed us to start just calling it fossil gas to make it a different branding. But but yeah, fossil gas has been dominating electricity generation in much of the U.S. As coal has been wound down, and gas and solar and wind have become more competitive. But yeah, we'll get to I wanted to highlight earlier what you were saying just about health effects and health matters, because it does seem like I think that obviously there's clear right to focus on climate change and the climate crisis, but it has effectively been turned into a political matter where many people who they don't know the full science, and they don't want to, they're not inclined to learn the full science, but they're fine going with some talking points about this or that are not correct, but are very popular and spread very wide on the right in particular, and not only, but to sort of discount the need for climate solutions and that kind of thing. And I do like just bring into the matter the health effects, the health matters. It's something that's sort of been lost in the discussion over the last 15 years or so, and probably should be emphasized a lot more when we talk about these things, because the health effects are very real, very very severe, very dramatic, and that's something that it's harder to brainwash people about or trick people about. Like, they can understand pollution causes cancer, causes asthma, causes all kinds of health problems, and we don't want it. And so burning stuff that creates pollution is not what you want in your backyard. I love Mark Z. Jacobson. We've collaborated for a decade and a half. He's written articles and been on many podcasts with us, and he's always so adamant to focus on the health effects, and very astutely so, because we have to recognize that people don't like the look sometimes of wind turbines. They're not causing you cancer. They're not giving your kid asthma. Like, fossil gas, coal are doing these things every day, and the sooner we get off of them for clean power sources, the better. But when it comes down to it, money talks. It's about the money, right? So how is it that offshore wind power is able to push fossil gas off the market?
And sorry, I definitely will get to that, but just to build on what you're saying, I think you're absolutely right, and I think the problem has been that most people do not have the power plant in their backyard, right? Like, if you do have the power plant in your backyard, unfortunately, I think it's painfully clear how polluting it is, and so it really gets to sort of the fairness, the way that our energy system has been very unfair, right? Because there are those health effects, and a lot of times it's the people that they're on the beach maybe thinking about the visual impact, but then they go home and their air conditioner is running and it's causing those health effects, but it's not necessarily causing them for them. So
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, one of the most heartbreaking things for me, I mean, there were several things when this administration, Trump administration, took over, but that they immediately dismantled and stripped environmental justice initiatives, the Environmental Justice Division. You know, with centuries of abuse and inequity, you know, we've been doing the minimal thing to try to correct that, to try to fix these problems, and the attacks and the dismantling of environmental justice and DEI initiatives is just one of the most heartbreaking things, because it gets beyond political ideology and philosophy, and it's just about cruelty at this point. It's just about doing things or allowing things or doing things that hurt others consciously. And so I try to stay on the mid tier, the middle topics that might broaden the discussion. But at the end of the day, I think we have to talk about these kind of things to make a difference with these as well. So it's great that you emphasize that, and it is often not talked about when you talk about pollution and the health effects.
yeah. And I guess sort of the shorthand way I think about it and what I try to share with people is like the current way we make energy is unfair, right? Like you're causing health effects for other people, if not for yourself. And do you really want to be doing that every time you turn on the light or the air conditioner, right? I would rather have a system that's not hurting anyone's lungs, right? My daughter has asthma, and it just you think about that, and heart disease and cancer. These are all clearly correlated with burning fossil fuels. I don't want that system.
And even if the power plant isn't in your backyard, they have a bigger radius than a lot of people recognize. So most of us can't identify where power plants in our region are, but their effect, they go into the air obviously, and extend far beyond what we can see. So they do still reach a lot of people, but they obviously do disproportionately harm lower class people and minorities. But let's jump into the way that I guess the one challenge for offshore wind from when it broke onto the scene more or less in Europe about 15 years ago is that it's been more expensive up front. It's been more expensive than onshore wind or solar power. So while solar power, that's why I sort of mentioned 15 years ago. So 15 years ago, solar power was rising fast, costs were dropping, but it wasn't the cheapest source unless you did good long-term planning with 8-10 year total cost of system. But still, it was like the upfront costs were higher, so it was just sort of a baby on the scene. But as it's grown, as it's developed, it's become the cheapest source of new power capacity, new power plants. Onshore wind has become very cheap as well. So offshore wind is trying to break into like a clean power market, where onshore wind and solar are already very cheap, right? So how does that do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll say a couple things. One is sort of what we were just talking about when you think about the availability of solar or onshore wind, but start with solar, right? That it's very obvious we also need power at night, right? And so there's just going to be a need for power that solar cannot meet. And if we're not meeting it with, onshore wind, generally, there's just going to be this gap where we are meeting it with these, polluting fossil fuels. So I think there's sort of these, think of them as, if you divide all the hours in the year, there are some hours where solar just can't compete. And then onshore wind also, we've discovered there are limits to how much onshore wind you can build, especially if you think about the Northeast corridor. there's just there's not a lot of open space. There's not a lot of you know, good sites. There still are, but when you look offshore, that's where you get these just gigawatts and gigawatts of energy that you can harness. So I think it really comes back to the fact that we still need much more power and at certain hours of the day than onshore wind and solar can provide.
Yeah, and as the industry has matured a bit abroad, I'm sure costs have come down a lot in the last decade, right?
There's that. On the U.S. side, right, we are still trying to onshore the manufacturing and the supply chain. So that is, ideally, we are going to be successful in that. We're already starting to see, right, U.S.-made vessels, a new cable factory in Virginia. So, right, we have in this sort of near-term phase, we are still paying slightly higher prices to import all the parts of the supply chain. So that's expected to come down. The other thing, and you've probably seen this, but turbine technology has improved a lot, even in the last 10 years. So we have, I think I was counting, we have 19 turbines sort of from pilot completed projects spinning. There are more being constructed as we speak. But the first, I would say 7 of those, I think they are 6 megawatt turbines. So they're capturing 6 megawatts of energy. Those are sort of one generation. The newer ones are 11, 12, and in some cases 15 megawatt turbines. So the technology has improved. So we're capturing more energy sort of per turbine.
There are a lot of fun charts of how turbine sizes get larger and larger. I visited Baltic 2, I believe, offshore wind power plant, I think 10 years ago. And yeah, they're massive, but these were like now just tiny compared to what they're putting up. So it's like, like with anything, with any technology, the technology improves. So the benefit to being late, I guess we could say, is that the technology is much more efficient and cost effective now than it was 10 years ago. But yeah, how does it end up winning on costs? And we can start with like, how does it do that today? How can it do that today? But then where does that get in 10 or 15 years as well? Like as we grow this industry in the U.S. as well.
Yeah, so that's a great question, the cost. And I'll start by saying that when people hear about the cost of offshore wind, and certainly when opponents are talking about the cost of offshore wind, what people are usually talking about is this contract price, because the way most of our offshore wind projects are being built is through the long-term contracts. And so power companies are entering into them on behalf of electric customers. And there is a price per megawatt hour in those contracts. We also call it the sticker price. But that is not the actual price that consumers pay. It's sort of it's almost like a benchmark that is in place for the financing. So the best way to think of that sticker price is like the gross price for offshore wind. If you're worried about your electric bill, what you really care about is the net price, right? And so that's the first step, is that most people see the sticker price, or the opponents point to the sticker price and they say that's the price of offshore wind. You have to look at the net price. So that's the first piece. Well, what is removed from that to arrive at the net price? I need to back up. I think we generally hear sort of people talking about, well, gas cost X and offshore wind cost Y. But you might notice when you get your electric bill, there's not this sort of itemized receipt of like, you paid for this price for gas and this price. The way we actually pay for energy is not like that at all. We pay for it through wholesale energy markets. And the price, if you're worried about your electric bill, you need to understand the wholesale price, and they're really complex markets. So you don't actually have to learn about the complex market, but the real question is, what does offshore wind do to the wholesale price, and what does gas do to the wholesale price? So,
And I'll tell you what, this is going on audio podcast channels, but we also publish on our YouTube channel, so youtube.com/CleanTechnica. And you sent me a great video, 50-second clip. So for people listening, I can overlay that at this point. So as you talk through this, you can try to reference the visuals a little bit. Sorry.
great.
But yeah, I guess for people listening on only podcast channels, just still have to try to tell them a little bit what you're referencing. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. And so just maybe before we start that, so the point is that the wholesale power price is really what you're paying. And the wholesale energy markets only look at the cost of making electricity in the moment. So like I checked New England this morning, the wholesale price was $20 per megawatt hour. So that fluctuates over time, but the big picture, there's some contracting that turns it into a retail rate, but that wholesale price is what is driving your bill. So it's only looking at the cost of making power in the moment, which is like your operating costs, or the economics term is, marginal costs. But it really turns out that it's mostly the cost of fuel. And so this gets back to what we were talking about, that, all fossil fuel generators, they're burning fuel. So they have to pay for fuel to make that electricity. Offshore wind, just like onshore wind and solar, their fuel is free. And so, great, this is the animation. So in the wholesale market, the grid operator is trying to keep costs down. And so they actually arrange power plants in order.
And just tell me if you want me to pause it at any moment, okay?
Oh, great.
Sorry.
No, that's great. So this is a very big simplification of how power plants work. Okay, if you can pause it right there. Thank you. So each of these circles, and for people listening, we're just simplifying, showing all the power plants that are bidding into the wholesale market. Everyone bids in essentially they're trying to get into this market by offering the lowest price that they can to deliver power. And the grid operator picks the least expensive first, and and then if we need more power, goes to the next least expensive. It's like a reverse auction. And this works out really well for consumers because only the power plants with the lowest running costs are turned on. So offshore wind comes into this with its free fuel advantage. So we can see that it's going to come in from the left-hand side of this graph. It is essentially always going to be picked to run because it has these almost zero operating costs. And so just pausing for the video to catch up. So you can see it pushes out those higher cost plants. They do not get turned on. And then here's what happens to that price. You can see it's set at the highest fuel price. When offshore wind pushes those higher price plants out, it lowers that price point. And that price point, again, is what's in your electric bill, essentially. So now I think it's just on repeat. But thank you, Zach. And I was thinking generally that if we had to do it without visuals, and so if people are just listening, if you just picture, because we're in summer, it's easy for me to picture an above ground swimming pool, and you picture the ladder in that swimming pool, that the steps on that ladder are like the price of power.
That's good.
So, yeah, I feel like people can relate to that.
I like that. Yeah.
So the grid operators, they run these wholesale markets. They're trying to keep that the level of water as low as possible because that's how much we're paying for energy, right? And so they only sort of let into the market the plants with the lowest costs. So offshore wind comes in the pool basically near zero. But just picturing a simple example, say the next lowest cost is $5 per megawatt hour. So you picture that bottom rung on the ladder is $5 per megawatt hour. Okay, they're in the pool in the market. The next step, say, costs $10 per megawatt hour. Say there's a third power plant in there. So the price goes up another rung of the ladder. The the piece that is hard to sort of understand, but if you've ever filled an above ground swimming pool, you know, if you have to cover that next rung, you have to fill, you can't just cover the rung locally, right? That's not how water works. Like you have to fill the entire pool up to that level. So what it means in the market is that that power plant that only needs its fuel costs $5 per megawatt hour, it's getting paid that higher price, that $10. And so we go up that ladder, and if you picture the hose as being attached to your bank account, right? You really don't want to go up that ladder because you're paying everyone in the market that higher price. It's not the individual power plants.
Yeah, I'm so used to that visual that it wasn't even thinking like, how do you explain that without showing it? You know, I really like that. Yeah, actually, our community pool has been retiled, and they had some tiles they had to fix, and it's taken months. And you know, as we're getting into hot summers, kids get out of school. It's like, why is the pool not done yet? But they're just filling it up this week, so it's a good comparison for us. But yeah, I think one thing too to say about it is to understand it is, you know, the grid needs electricity, you know, consistently, and as it asks for, you know, you to sell your electricity that you're producing from your power plant, whatever, to the market, it's going to take the cheapest electricity it can take. And a wind or solar power plant has, once it's installed, once it's in operation, once it's available to provide electricity, there's almost no extra cost to produce that and send it to the grid. So the first sources that are going to be able to bid the lowest, almost nothing, if they need to, are solar and wind power. So basically, yeah, those are going to be the first sources the grid is taking there, and because they can underbid everyone, it's like an auction or a, you know, whatever you're haggling or whatever. The lower you can offer, the more you're going to drag down the overall bidding and overall price. So it's something, yeah, that's not, it's still hard to explain, and still like people think, oh, are renewables more expensive, but if you understand that's how the electricity markets work, then you can understand that wind and solar around the world are consistently driving down electricity prices because they can bid so low. They can bid basically as low as needed.
Exactly.
And yeah, in some markets, if they're subsidized, they can even bid in negative territory. Then we get into negative pricing. That's very complicated. That's
It's
good for headlines, but it's confusing.
That's exactly it. I'm glad you made that point, sort of that once it's built, then that's the case, right? That the energy, like it's very low cost to operate. And so that's sort of what, getting back to the big pictures, you do have to pay to build it. And that, getting back to those contract prices, those are really just sort of ways of paying over the long term for construction costs. And so, you know, always have to be careful to point out there are these wholesale market benefits that are significant. There's also the cost of building it. That's that sticker price. You have to talk about both.
And then if we really get wonky, you have the benefit of electricity you need. You also have the benefit of consistency and reliability and stability and grid security. And so there's also other benefits that offshore wind power brings that onshore and solar don't bring, even, that are valuable, that provide extra value. So you get more value out of offshore wind power. So it's not necessarily a problem that it costs a little more too sometimes. You know, if you're getting enough extra value, the extra cost compared to onshore wind or solar can be worth it, right? So how is that story in the Northeast there?
Yeah, we actually have the numbers just worked out that it's a very simple story to tell. We do pay sort of for these reliability sort of insurance programs in New England, in particular, because we do come close to running out of having enough energy supply in the winter, basically because we're far away from gas supplies. But again, we are very close to these offshore wind supplies. But we have had to pay. This has affected my electric bill in New Hampshire, electric bills all through New England. We've basically had to pay for piles of backup fuel, like just to make sure we get through the winter. And because fuel, this is another problem on the fuel side, it's traded in global commodity markets. So the price of the backup fuel that we've all been paying for was set by the Dutch TTF. I can't even remember what it stands for, but it's an international benchmark. Turned out to be, I think this past winter we paid $78 million for that program. And if the peak winter season is about 90 days. But when I say the numbers worked out, we are generally in the ballpark of paying about $1 million a day collectively for that insurance.
Wow.
And
Yeah,
right,
yeah,
we can't.
that's crazy. Yeah,
Our electric bills are already high enough, and so when you talk about the value of offshore wind, the grid operators models and our studies too show that you don't need to pay for that backup fuel. When you add offshore wind, it has these strong winter winds, so we don't have to pay for those reliability programs.
yeah. What you were talking about at the beginning, actually leading with, which is sort of circling back to it, and yeah, a lot of people they think, okay, coal or nuclear power plant runs all the time, doesn't need backup. First of all, they don't run all the time. When they go offline, it's actually a dramatic experience because they provide so much power from one unit that if they suddenly go offline, you have a serious problem. So it's not the same as like one turbine or one solar power panel going off grid. So the centralized nature, the non-distributed nature of them provides a challenge if they do suddenly go off power, off grid. And whether it's because of, to prevent that or because there are spikes in demand at times, we always have these backup power plants. We always have these extra power plants, often even can be just running without being used. And as you pointed out in that graph, the peaker plants are the ones that when electricity demand gets really high and you need extra supply to match it, that's when peaker plants come on and provide electricity, but they do it at a very high cost. So they're extremely expensive. Peaker plants are extremely expensive to run, but they're currently the emergency backup for variability in demand and supply. And yeah, if offshore wind power is so consistent, so predictable, so steady, and provides so much at key times, then you can stop using peaker plants that are extremely expensive and raise the price of electricity. So it's
Exactly.
I think
Yeah,
go
I can
ahead.
just give an example because we actually just experienced this past winter. So you're sort of you're describing something that we have sort of concrete numbers for that. So this past winter, we have this small number of turbines currently, but essentially we are still we don't have these big offshore wind projects yet. And we did have some very cold weather this past winter, and we did have to turn on peakers. And so if we think back to that above ground pool or in ground pool, but if we think about the ladder, we had to go very far up on the ladder. And if you also picture that the rungs became increasingly far apart. So we were seeing, I think the average price became like $130 per megawatt hour. So if you picture...
It's sort of like you're going up to a diving board more, right?
Exactly, yeah, exactly. But imagine having to fill, imagine a really tall pool, essentially, and having to go up those really high rungs. At the same time, there are all sorts of dynamics, but the price of gas was going up almost exponentially because, especially in New England, this is also true in New York, the gas supply, when it's cold, suddenly goes away, like from the electric grid's point of view. It is dedicated to heating, which is good, right? Keeping all those gas furnaces going. But we had a few days this past winter where all of our gas pipelines were full, dedicated to heating, and the gas power plants were scrambling to get fuel. They had to use liquefied natural gas imported from other countries. And so if you think these are sort of this is the high dive, really high price on the ladder. And I think prices went up at different months in this past winter. They were up 200 to 300% for gas. So what did that do to the wholesale price, right? And we had to pay everyone that incredibly high price. And the sort of the big takeaway, it was the most expensive winter in a decade in New England. And we paid $4 billion for energy for 3 months, which is just, everyone's electric bill is going to go up because of that.
Yeah, that's going to make people happy.
Yeah. And so just to close it out, I mean, the offshore wind would take you down that wholesale market. We would not have had to burn that much LNG. We would have come way down on the ladder of that wholesale price and, spent much less money if offshore wind had been operating. And there's actually going to be a study coming out, sort of a teaser here, but Daymark Energy is looking at those numbers right now. If we had Vineyard Wind, Revolution Wind, South Coast Wind, and New England Wind, those are the 2 projects currently negotiating contracts in New England. If we had had that fleet, which is still just a fraction of what we could build, we just already know, you can see that it would have really pushed a lot of expensive gas plants offline.
So we have to get you back on when that comes out, and we'll get super wonky and we'll say, if you want an intro discussion, go to this. But we're going to get into some really wonky stuff here. So I think a lot of people would enjoy that. But I'd be fascinated to see those results and see the numbers and the details. I think you've done a great job of explaining some things that are quite difficult to explain. It goes beyond sort of the typical discussions about clean power and dirty power. So great stuff. I am curious. I know you know New England and the Northeast. Do you know much about the potential elsewhere in the country, like around Florida, the South Atlantic coast, the Northwest? Are there any other regions you would like to highlight for their potential? Because I know nowhere is as far along as the Northeast is with offshore wind, but curious.
No, that's a great question. I mean, the answer, I mean, there is potential all along our coast and also in the Great Lakes. I'd say the short answer is there's potential everywhere. If you look at National Renewable Energy Lab, they have maps that show sort of where it's the strongest. There's very strong offshore wind off the West Coast, and so they are looking at that. The challenge there technically is that it's very deep water. So to harness that strong wind, you'd need floating offshore wind. But that technology we already have several projects in the world that are demonstrated it, including one in Maine. I'd say in the Gulf of Mexico, there's also relatively strong winds. It's not quite as good as the Northeast, but there is potential so that we could harness it still economically. And there's also a lot of just technology transfer from the oil and gas industry, that there's sort of a built-in infrastructure for offshore operations that could make that attractive. And then the Southeast, just your neck of the woods, I think there are still relatively good resource. I think hurricane risk can be higher, but at the same time, the technology has been developed so that it can withstand, do pretty well through hurricane winds.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was of the understanding that it was adequate, prepared for that, but it does always depend. If you're going to get a nearly Category 6, then you're going to be in a different territory. We've been hit by 2 in the recent years, very hard. Where I'm on the Gulf Coast, so. But yeah, it is. You know, you just think about the objectively. If we were all objective, rational characters, the ability to transfer skills from offshore oil and gas to offshore wind power. You know, it's just such a perfect thing to be able to do, a perfect benefit of it. If we were, sensible enough to use the opportunity and to transition intelligently. But yeah, great stuff. So really appreciate the whole discussion. Loved it, and look forward to. Well, okay. One more question before your final thoughts. So, what is the potential now in the Northeast for scaling up the industry and putting in big power projects? We've covered some of the back and forth of the Trump administration trying to cancel projects that were already approved, and those companies fighting back and getting the train back on the tracks. But yeah, what is the situation? What is the potential right now for actually develop some large projects in the Northeast?
Yeah, good question. I'd say we have two projects in New England, Vineyard Wind and Revolution Wind, are actively being built. Two in New York, so thinking of the Northeast, and then even it's just probably worth mentioning there's also a massive project being built off of Virginia, the coastal Virginia offshore wind. So I'd say in terms of near-term potential, assuming those projects are allowed to continue, which yeah, I think we should assume that, because we don't want to be a country where once you have your permits, you can't rely on them. So assuming those projects go forward, that would be, I think it's about 5,800 megawatts of offshore wind, which is, I think I did the numbers right. It's like 2.5 million homes could be powered just from those projects alone. So that's sort of the first tier that I think about. Then we have many multiples of that have been, they've been studied. These offshore wind lease areas have been carefully studied. We know that the energy could be harnessed, and several projects that have been permitted. I would say longer term, all of the things that we've talked about remain unchanged, right? It's still a massive energy resource. It's located close to where we need the energy. Its profile is like a perfect match, especially in New England and New York, for the power needs. We need more power when it's cold. So I can't predict exactly what's going to happen with those sort of middle and longer term projects, but we know that the energy, the value of that energy is just so big for the region. And so, we're going to continue to point that out. I'd say several, we have state leaders and local leaders that also see that value. So we're just going to continue to point that out, and we hope that it is, we're allowed to capture it. And I should also mention the other massive benefit here, which is jobs, right? These are really good jobs. Building offshore wind projects don't need a 4-year degree for. And so just that one project in New York, I think is 1,500 people were working on the Empire Wind project. And so thankfully they are back to work. And the supply chain, I think, is now in 40 states. We're building, as I mentioned, ships in Louisiana, cables in Virginia. I think there's a steel plant in Kentucky. So I guess to your point, all of those benefits are associated with building these projects. And so we just hope that we can continue to bring those benefits, for everyone.
Yeah. Great stuff. I love it. I feel like that we had final thoughts already, but I'll give you opportunity if there's anything you wanted to wrap up or bring back into the discussion as close. That seemed like a good close already.
I'd say, keep the fuel out of the pool, right?
Yes. That metaphor is going to stick with me. I might not be able to go to the pool without thinking about it. It's probably all summer. All right. Well, thanks a lot. Thank you for what you're doing, and keep us posted when when that study you mentioned comes out, we get back into it and look at some numbers.
That'd be great. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you.